The day I opened that worn-out Bible was the day my entire world shifted. One thin piece of paper slipped to the floor, carrying 7 words that froze the air around me. If she finds out, end it, for good. Those words tore through everything I thought I knew about love. Trust and safety. My name is Geraldine Miller, and I am 78 years old now. What I'm about to tell you has slept in my heart for nearly 5 decades. Before you settle in, please remember to hit that like button and tell me where you're watching from. Your messages keep this old lady's stories alive. Let's go back to 1969. I was 29 then, living in a quiet Virginia town that seemed untouched by the chaos shaking the rest of America. The Vietnam War and civil rights marches blazed across television screens, but in our neighborhood, life moved at the same unhurried rhythm. Sunday church bells, grocery lines, and children chasing fireflies. I had been married 10 years to Anthony Miller, the town's trusted banker. People admired his discipline, his pressed suits, his calm smile, his punctuality. To the world, we were the picture of a perfect family. Our modest home sat on a tree-lined street. Dahlias bloomed in the front yard that I tended every morning. Our 2 children, Michael and Teresa, were my pride and heartbeat. Each day began before dawn. I baked bread, packed school lunches, and brewed Anthony's coffee while he read the morning paper. Once the family left, I tidied the house and spent hours sewing for the women in town, a craft my late mother had taught me. A woman must have a skill she can hold in her own hands, she used to say. I never knew those words would become my lifeline. Outsiders saw harmony. Insiders, only I, felt the cracks. Anthony's affection appeared only when others were watching. He was polite but distant, always busy. Every first Thursday of the month he traveled for bank meetings. When I once asked why, his eyes hardened. You have food and a home. That's all you need to know. I stopped asking. Then came Sunday, August 17th, 1969, my mother's birthday. The children were at my mother-in-law's for lunch, and Anthony claimed he had urgent paperwork at the bank. A terrible migraine kept me in bed until I remembered the stronger medicine in his office. He never let anyone inside. A man needs his space to think. But pain won over obedience that day. His office smelled of tobacco and cologne. Searching for the pills, I accidentally knocked a Bible from the shelf. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, and from its yellowed pages fluttered that folded note. I almost placed it back, but curiosity or fate stopped me. The handwriting belonged to Edward, the bank manager, and Anthony's closest friend. If she finds out, end it. For good. The ache in my skull vanished, replaced by a deeper, colder pain. Who was she? What truth? And who was meant to end whom? I slipped the note back between the pages, restored the room, and lay still on the sofa until Anthony returned home. That night, as he laughed with our children over dinner, I smiled too. But something inside me had changed forever. If one note could destroy a marriage, what else might it uncover? In part 2, I would learn that secrets buried in silence can whisper louder than screams. From that day forward, every moment of my life became an act of quiet theater. Outwardly, I was still Mrs. Geraldine Miller, the dependable wife who prepared hot meals, ironed shirts, and smiled on cue. But inside, I was rehearsing a different role, that of a woman pretending not to know the truth. Each morning, I rose before sunrise and continued my routine as if nothing had changed. The children's laughter echoed through the kitchen, while Anthony sat at the table, sipping his coffee, buried behind the newspaper. Yet, as he turned each page, I studied him. The way his fingers trembled ever so slightly, the hesitation before answering a question, the fleeting glance toward the locked drawer of his desk. Things I once ignored now blazed in my mind like warning lights. I began to notice patterns. The first Thursday of every month, his business trip, had always sounded routine, but now those absences seemed darker. He returned from them unusually calm, almost too serene, as if relieved to step back into our quiet home after committing a sin elsewhere. When I once suggested accompanying him on one of those trips, his answer came with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Geraldine, a bank conference isn't a place for ladies. You'd be bored to tears. And that was the end of it. Days passed with slow torment. I felt like a detective hiding behind her own curtains. My mind was a storm of questions. Who wrote the note? What truth had I stumbled upon? And the question that haunted me the most, was my husband capable of doing what the note suggested? A week later, while ironing one of his suits, I found my first piece of tangible evidence. A small, crumpled receipt sat inside his jacket pocket, from a jewelry store in Richmond, the nearest city. The price was far beyond anything we could afford, and the item purchased was chillingly specific: 1 diamond engagement ring. Anthony had never given me a diamond, not even for our anniversary. My wedding band was simple gold, modest like the life I thought we shared. My hands shook as I placed the receipt back exactly where I found it. My heart thudded so loud I thought it would betray me. That same night, as Anthony returned home and kissed me on the cheek, I felt that tiny piece of paper burning in my mind like a confession written in smoke. Over the following days, I wove small lies of my own. I claimed I needed to visit Richmond to buy special fabrics for my sewing work. In truth, I was following the trail of that receipt. My search led me to an elegant neighborhood where the streets were lined with trimmed hedges and polished cars. That was where I found the address scribbled on the back of the jewelry store slip. A neat white house with blue shutters. Through the open gate, I saw a woman tending roses, her belly gently rounded with pregnancy. The neighbor watering next door greeted me cheerfully when I asked who lived there. "Oh, that's Miss Marianne, the young school teacher. Such a lovely girl. Her fiancé visits every first Thursday. Poor thing. He's still settling things with his ex-wife before the wedding." Her words echoed in my ears until the world went silent. First Thursday. Ex-wife. The pieces fell into place, cutting deep as they connected. I smiled politely, thanked the neighbor, and walked away, each step heavier than the last. The truth had a face now, young, pregnant, and waiting for my husband. But that was only the beginning. In part 3, I discovered that betrayal was just one layer of something far darker. For nights after seeing that woman in Richmond, I couldn't sleep. I would lie beside Anthony, listening to his steady breathing, wondering how a man could rest so easily with so much deceit in his heart. The same hands that held our children's faces at breakfast were now wrapped around another woman, and possibly another life. But heartbreak soon gave way to something sharper than grief: clarity. I realized that confronting him then would be dangerous. The note in the Bible wasn't a simple threat. It was a plan, a warning whispered between conspirators, and I needed to know exactly what that plan was before I made a move. So I turned my pain into purpose. Every smile became a disguise, every conversation a silent interrogation. Anthony started spending more hours at the bank, claiming they were preparing for a major financial transfer. I asked harmless questions, the kind a curious wife might. He dismissed them quickly, but I noticed something in his tone, a nervous flicker beneath the usual arrogance. One Sunday, after church, I met Iris, the bank's new secretary, a kind widow who had moved to town a few months earlier. I struck up conversation about fabrics, weather, and eventually work. She spoke freely, unaware of the storm building inside me. "Mr. Miller and Mr. Edwards have been staying late," she said. "They're organizing a big transfer. Hundreds of thousands coming in for the textile factory project. It's all anyone at the bank can talk about." My mind raced. Edward, the same man whose handwriting had cursed my name in that Bible. So he and Anthony were still working together, preparing something big. The timing matched perfectly with Anthony's next trip. By then, my suspicion had evolved into certainty. This wasn't only adultery, it was theft. A plan to steal the bank's funds and disappear with Marianne. And that note, if she finds out, suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. That night, while Anthony read in his armchair, I sat quietly across the room pretending to mend a hem. My fingers worked the needle, but my thoughts were elsewhere, mapping every step, every option, every risk. The firelight flickered over his face, casting shadows that made him look like a stranger. I remembered a strange key I had once found months earlier, tucked inside his shaving kit. When I asked about it, he had snatched it away, muttering something about old bank files. At the time, I let it go. But now, the image of that key returned like an unanswered riddle. The next morning, after he left for work and the children for school, I began to search. The drawers, the wardrobe, behind the books on his office shelf. Nothing. Then my hand brushed against something hollow. A fake book, carved from the inside. Inside it lay the key. It opened a small metal box hidden behind the travel bags in the wardrobe. Inside were documents, ship tickets under false names, and a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. My hands trembled as I read the first line of one. My love, soon will be free from that miserable town and the woman who traps you. Our child will be born under a new sky. I sat on the floor, the world collapsing around me. Every fear was true, and worse. They weren't just leaving me. They were stealing, running, and if necessary, erasing me from their story. I thought I had uncovered the worst, but I was wrong. In Part 4, I'd learned that survival sometimes demands becoming the very thing others never expect. Dangerous. I sat on the floor of that dim bedroom, the metal box open before me, my trembling hands flipping through the evidence of a life I'd never known existed. Inside were 2 ship tickets to Buenos Aires, both dated 2 weeks ahead, under the names Anthony Moore and Marianne Oliver. There were also fake identification cards, a stash of cash, and a neat pile of love letters, each one signed with a looping M. I read one after another. The ink smudged in places where tears, hers or mine, had blurred the words. Only 2 weeks, my darling. Edward says everything is ready. Once you finish the transfer, we'll board the ship as planned. Don't worry about her. She won't be a problem. Soon, it'll just be us and our baby. The letter slipped from my hands. The pounding of my heart drowned out every other sound. It wasn't only betrayal anymore, it was a conspiracy. My husband was about to steal the bank's money, vanish with his mistress, and, if necessary, remove me from the picture. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the open box. The woman I had been for 10 years, the obedient wife who baked bread, ironed shirts, and stayed silent. She ended right there. Something new took her place. I wiped my tears, placed every item exactly where I found it, and locked the box again. The key went back into the hollow book. Nothing in that room could reveal what I now knew, but inside me, a different kind of resolve was forming. Cold, deliberate, and sharper than grief. I had 2 weeks until the date printed on those tickets. 2 weeks to stop a man capable of stealing and killing from destroying what was left of our lives. That night, I served dinner as if nothing had changed. Anthony complimented the roast chicken, joked with the children, and discussed his trip to Richmond for the big transfer. I smiled and nodded, my voice calm, my hand steady. Inside, I was already building a counterplan. The next morning, after sending the children to school, I began the first step, securing my own future. Anthony controlled every penny of our finances, but I had been saving a small amount for years from my sewing work. I gathered those envelopes, counted the cash twice, and tucked it into my handbag. It was barely enough to start over, but it was mine. That evening, as I watched Anthony reading in the living room, I realized something important. He had no idea that I knew. And that ignorance, his arrogance, would be my weapon. He looked up once, smiled faintly, and said, "You look lost in thought, dear." I smiled back, calm and unreadable. "Yes," I said softly, "just thinking about the future." 2 weeks. That was all the time I had to turn fear into strategy. In Part 5, I'd begin setting a trap, not for revenge, but for survival. From that night onward, every breath I took was measured. Every smile, every word, every glance at Anthony was carefully stitched into the mask I wore. He thought I was the same quiet wife, patient, harmless, too timid to ask questions. But inside, I was learning how to survive. The first step was independence. For 10 years, Anthony had handled every coin, every bill, every signature. "A husband's job is to manage," he always said, and I had obeyed. But obedience had turned into a cage, and now I needed a key. By chance, or fate, my wealthiest client, Mrs. Eulalia, was in town for her niece's wedding dress. While I adjusted lace on her fitting, she spoke about her late husband's accounts in Richmond. I seized the moment. "I've been thinking of opening an account myself," I said lightly. "Just for my sewing business." She looked at me over her gold-rimmed glasses and smiled. "Then do it, dear. Never let anyone keep you poor or powerless. That very week, Mrs. Eulalia drove me to a different bank, one where Anthony and Edward had no influence. I opened a private account under my own name, depositing every bit of the money I had secretly saved. For the first time in years, I held proof of something that belonged solely to me. It wasn't much, but it was freedom in the form of a balance slip. The next step was evidence. I already knew the truth, but knowing wasn't enough. If I accused Anthony without proof, he could twist my words into madness or jealousy. I needed facts, the kind no one could argue against. While he left early for work, I began my secret mission. His office became my hunting ground. Using an old Kodak Instamatic camera hidden in my sewing basket, I photographed ledgers, correspondence, and invoices he left on the desk. The camera clicked softly like a heartbeat. Each photo revealed more: fake transactions, forged signatures, even accounts under names of people who had passed away. He and Edward had been stealing small amounts for years, building toward the final heist. But photographs weren't enough. I needed duplicates of original papers. That's when I turned to Mr. Moyers, the stationery shop owner whose sons attended school with Michael. I told him I was making a surprise scrapbook for Anthony's birthday, copies of important family papers. He hesitated but eventually allowed me to use his copier. By nightfall, I had a folder full of incriminating proof hidden beneath rolls of fabric in my sewing room. Now came the hardest part: finding someone trustworthy. In our small town, everyone either feared or respected the men at the bank. The sheriff played cards with them. The local judge had baptized our son. There was no one I could trust nearby. Then I remembered Inspector Mendez, the federal auditor who came once a year to review the bank's accounts. Anthony loathed him, calling him self-righteous and incorruptible. Those two words made him perfect. I just had to get my evidence into his hands, without Anthony ever suspecting. I had the proof and a plan, but not yet a path. In Part 6, I'd risk everything to reach the one man who could save my life, before my husband realized I'd already declared war. The hardest part of any plan isn't courage, it's timing. One wrong move, one suspicious glance, and everything can crumble. I had the proof. I had the motive. But what I didn't yet have was a way to get that envelope into Inspector Mendez's hands without Anthony catching even a whisper of it. Through quiet observation and a few careful questions to Iris, the bank's secretary, I learned that the inspector would be visiting the following week for a routine audit. He was scheduled to stay for 3 days at the Rosewood Inn, right across from the town square. The challenge was clear. That building was the beating heart of gossip. Anyone who saw me walk in would mention it before sunset. I needed another way. Providence, however, came disguised as a school friendship. My daughter Teresa had recently befriended Marietta, the innkeeper's daughter. The girls were inseparable, drawing together after school, trading ribbons and stories. One afternoon, I invited Marietta over for tea. As the girls played, I casually admired Mrs. Zawira's purse, a distinct leather bag with an embroidered lining. "It's lovely," I said, my tone light. Would she mind if I borrowed it for a few hours? I'd like to match the stitching for a custom dress. The next day, she sent it through Marietta with a sweet note. That bag became my secret courier. I spent the entire evening preparing. Inside a large envelope, I placed the photographs, copied documents, and a letter I had rewritten 6 times. My handwriting trembled, but the message was steady and clear. An explanation of Anthony and Edward's plan, the proof of the theft, the ship tickets, and the possible danger to my life. I slid the package into a hidden pocket inside the purse's lining and sewed the edge closed with invisible stitches. Alongside it, I tucked a small note. For Inspector Mendez, urgent. Please deliver discreetly upon his arrival. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a threat, every whisper of the wind like Anthony's footsteps. By morning, I had composed myself, after lunch. I took Teresa to the inn to return the borrowed bag. The square was busy with vendors, laughter and Sunday chatter, the perfect cover. Mrs. Zawira thanked me warmly, commenting that her guest rooms would soon fill with the inspector's staff. I smiled politely, my heart racing under my calm expression. When I walked away, my knees felt weak, but my soul lighter. The letter was out of my hands now. My truth carried inside that leather bag toward the one man who could expose Anthony before he exposed me. That evening, as I served dinner, Anthony was unusually quiet. He barely touched his food, staring into his plate with a faraway look. "Long day?" I asked softly. He nodded. "Very long. And it's just beginning." The words chilled me, though he spoke them without looking up. Perhaps he already sensed the walls beginning to close. The message was sent, but silence can be louder than a scream. In Part 7, I discover that justice was moving faster than I imagined, and danger even faster. Once the letter was gone, every hour felt like walking on cracked glass. I went through the motions of daily life, ironing clothes, preparing meals, attending church, all while wondering whether that hidden envelope had reached Inspector Mendez safely. Days blurred together, but Anthony's behavior began to shift. He grew restless, snapping at the children over small things, pacing the house at night as though waiting for something, or fearing it. When I asked if everything was all right at the bank, he gave me the same cold, controlled smile that had once fooled me. "Just tired, Geraldine. These numbers never stop." But his eyes betrayed him. The calm, confident man I had married was unraveling thread by thread. 3 days later, Iris stopped by my house under the pretense of ordering a new dress. Her hands trembled as she whispered while I measured her waistline. "Mrs. Miller, you didn't hear this from me, but Inspector Mendez asked for extra documents this morning. All transfers from the last 6 months. Mr. Edward and your husband looked like ghosts. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the rest of her words. The inspector had received the evidence. He was acting on it. Relief rushed through me, quickly followed by dread. If the men suspected the investigation started inside their homes, I would be the first person Anthony looked at. That evening, I pretended to sew in the living room while he worked in his office. Through the half-open door, I could hear the scratch of his pen and the soft creak of the chair. For the first time, I noticed something else, a note of fear in his movements. He checked the window blinds, shuffled papers rapidly, muttered to himself. When he finally emerged, his face was pale. "Geraldine," he said, forcing a smile, "we might have to postpone that family outing next Sunday. I'll be busy with work." "Of course," I replied, steady as ever. "The children will understand." Inside, I felt my stomach twist. That outing had been planned for the day after the money transfer, likely the day he intended to disappear. His postponement meant he was already preparing for something unexpected. That night, after he fell asleep, I crept quietly into the children's room. Michael's small hand rested outside the blanket. Teresa's breathing was soft and even. I tucked them in and whispered a promise I hadn't dared to say aloud before. "No matter what happens, I'll keep you safe." Back in my room, I watched the clock tick past midnight. My heart was at war with my mind. Relief for having acted, fear for what might come next. I knew Inspector Mendez wouldn't move without evidence strong enough to corner them completely. But Anthony was clever, desperate, and dangerous. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock, counting down the days until the inevitable confrontation. Justice was now in motion, but so was suspicion. In Part 8, the storm would finally break, and one wrong move could cost me everything I'd fought to protect. The morning of the transfer day arrived draped in uneasy calm. The air itself seemed heavy, as if the town held its breath. The sky was crystal blue, deceptively peaceful, but I could feel the storm rising behind the stillness. Anthony woke earlier than usual. He dressed in silence, adjusting his tie twice, glancing at his watch every few minutes. He kissed the children's foreheads, then my cheek, an act of tenderness that felt rehearsed, as though he were saying goodbye rather than good morning. "I'll be late tonight," he murmured. "Don't wait for me for dinner." I smiled gently. "Of course, dear. I'll keep a plate warm." My voice was steady, but my pulse pounded so loudly that I feared he could hear it. Once he left, I locked the door and exhaled the breath I'd been holding for weeks. The moment of reckoning had come. Either the inspector would stop him before he vanished, or I'd become the woman mentioned in that note, the one who had found out. I spent the morning preparing for every outcome. Important papers, children's certificates, money, and photographs, all were sorted and hidden in 2 small cloth bundles beneath my bed. If I had to flee, we'd be ready within minutes. By noon, the hours dragged painfully slow. I took the children to school, sewed to keep my trembling hands busy, and prayed under my breath with every stitch. At around 4 o'clock, Iris appeared again, pale, breathless, pretending to adjust a dress I'd finished last week. Her whisper came out like thunder. "They're here. The inspectors. From the capital. They arrived with police guards, straight to the bank. Mr. Edward was locked in a room with them. Your husband tried to leave, but they stopped him." Her words hit me like a rush of wind. The trap had closed. Anthony was caught. I thanked her quietly, pretending to stay calm, though my entire body shook. After she left, I sank into my chair by the sewing machine, tears of relief and terror blurring my vision. It was over. But what would come next? I collected the children from school early, taking them to Lucinda's house, Anthony's sister, under the excuse of needing to work late on a client's dress. She welcomed them kindly, unaware of the storm that was swallowing her brother's life. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll keep them overnight." When I returned home, the sun was setting, the sky a bleeding orange. The house was silent except for the ticking clock. I didn't know whether to wait or run. Then, as twilight deepened, sirens wailed in the distance, sharp, rising, unstoppable. 3 police cars roared past my street toward the town center. Half an hour later, someone banged on my door. My heart leapt into my throat. When I opened it, Lucinda stood there, pale as the moonlight. "Geraldine, they've arrested Anthony. He and Edward were caught trying to steal the factory's funds. The whole town's out there. It's chaos." My legs nearly gave way. She grabbed my arm, steadying me. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. The danger was over. But the shame, the judgment, and the whispers were only beginning. My husband's betrayal was now public, but survival is never as simple as justice. In Part 9, I'd face the town, the truth, and the woman who had unknowingly shared my name and my nightmare. That night, the sirens faded, but their echo lived in my bones. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock, the same one that had marked our dinners, birthdays, and quiet nights for 10 years. It ticked on, indifferent, the sound of time moving forward while everything else stood still. Anthony was gone. My husband, the respected banker, the man I had built my life around, was now a criminal headline waiting to be printed. When dawn came, I hadn't slept a minute. I walked to Lucinda's house to check on the children. Michael ran to me, his small arms clinging tightly. Teresa smiled, but her eyes were full of questions she didn't yet know how to ask. I hugged them both longer than I should have, breathing in the scent of safety. Lucinda pressed a cup of coffee into my hands. "You don't have to face them today. Stay here till things calm down." But hiding would only make the whispers louder. I shook my head. "No, if I stay behind curtains, they'll say I knew everything. If I walk out there, they'll have to look me in the eyes." I went home, bathed, and chose one of my best dresses, navy blue with white stitching, one I'd sewn myself. My hair was neat, my chin lifted. If the world wanted to see the thief's wife, I'd make them see a woman, not a victim. The moment I stepped into the street, I felt the weight of every gaze. Neighbors paused mid-conversation, pretending not to stare. At the market, the usual chatter fell into a hush. Even the butcher's wife, who used to gossip about everyone, only nodded stiffly before turning away. Then, from behind the counter, Mrs. Zoira, the innkeeper, broke the silence. "Mrs. Miller," she said gently, "you've shown remarkable courage. Not everyone could walk through town after a blow like this. If you need help with the children, you come to me, dear." Her kindness steadied me. I smiled, thanked her, bought milk and bread, and walked out with my head high. I was shaking inside, but they didn't need to see that. That small victory, walking through those streets without collapsing, gave me a strange kind of strength. For the first time in years, I realized that Anthony no longer defined me. 2 days later, a letter from the authorities arrived. I was summoned to the capital to give a formal statement, They needed confirmation that I hadn't been involved in the fraud. My hands trembled as I read it, not from fear of guilt, but from fear of facing him again. The morning of the hearing, I kissed my children goodbye and boarded the 5 a.m. bus. The road stretched endlessly, lined with fog and quiet farms. Every mile took me farther from the woman who once believed her husband could do no wrong. At the station, I was escorted into a cold room with 3 men, Inspector Mendez, a prosecutor, and a clerk. They asked questions gently at first, then more precisely. I answered everything truthfully, except one thing. I never admitted that it was me who had sent the evidence. When they finished, the inspector looked at me thoughtfully. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "whoever delivered those documents saved many lives, maybe even yours." I met his eyes, but said nothing. Some truths didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The law had caught the criminals, but freedom came with a price. In Part 10, I'd faced the ruins of my old life, and a letter from the one woman I never wanted to hear from again. The bus ride home from the capital felt longer than the journey there. The road wound through quiet fields, sunlight flickering across the window like memories I couldn't outrun. My hands clutched my handbag tightly. Not for the few coins inside, but for what it represented. My testimony was done. The truth had been spoken, the lies exposed. Yet somehow I didn't feel free. I felt hollow. When I stepped off the bus, the air in my little town felt different, thinner, colder. Neighbors no longer whispered as loudly, but their glances were heavier, full of curiosity and pity. Overnight I had become a symbol, the wife who didn't know. At Lucinda's house, the children ran to me. Michael's face was serious for a boy his age. "Mama," he asked quietly, "are they going to take our house?" His question hit me harder than any insult. I knelt beside him. "They might, sweetheart. But a house is only walls. What matters is that we stay together." Days later, the notice came. The bank was repossessing our home. Everything Anthony owned, including our house, was tied to the institution he'd betrayed. We had 30 days to leave. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The walls seemed to whisper fragments of our past. Birthdays, laughter, the clinking of dishes at dinner. Every echo hurt. But every hurt also reminded me that those memories belonged to me, not to the man who ruined them. The next morning I made the decision I had been avoiding. I wrote to Louise, my childhood friend who lived in the capital and ran a small sewing studio. I told her part of the truth, that I needed a place to stay, work to keep my children fed, a chance to start again. Her reply came faster than I expected. "Come, Gertie. There's always room for you. We'll rebuild together." Her kindness was a light cutting through the fog. But before we could leave, another letter arrived, one that made my hands tremble as I unfolded it. The handwriting was delicate, almost too familiar. The scent of perfume clung to the paper. It was from Marianne. "Mrs. Miller, I don't expect forgiveness. I only want you to know that I too was deceived. He told me your marriage was over, that he was free. Now I am left with a child on the way, no money, and a name everyone despises. I never wished you pain. I only wish I'd known the truth sooner." I folded the letter slowly and placed it in my sewing box, not out of forgiveness, but because hatred felt too heavy to carry. By the time the month ended, I had sold what little furniture was mine, packed our clothes, and prepared to leave the house that had once been our dream. I didn't look back as the door closed for the last time. The road to the capital was long, but this time I wasn't running away. I was walking toward something new. In Part 11, the city would greet me not with comfort, but with challenge. And among its crowded streets, I would begin to rebuild the woman I was always meant to become. It was a rainy Wednesday in October when the past found me again. The studio smelled of fabric and fresh starch. The rhythmic hum of the sewing machine filled the room like a heartbeat. I was finishing a graduation dress for a client when I heard a knock at the door. Soft, hesitant, the kind that doesn't demand to be answered but hopes to be. "Michael, could you see who it is?" I called out, still pinning the final hem. A moment later, his voice came, uncertain. "Mom, there's a lady here and a baby." I turned, wiping my hands on my apron. The world seemed to tilt before I even reached the doorway. Standing there, soaked from the rain, was Marianne. Her hair clung to her face, Her eyes hollow but pleading. In her arms, wrapped in a faded blanket, slept a baby boy. Small, peaceful, and painfully familiar. Time didn't move for several seconds. We simply stared at each other, the sound of rain filling the space between us. My mind screamed with memories. Her letters, her betrayal, her name written on those forged ship tickets beside my husband's. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. "Please," I should have shut the door. I should have told her to leave me and my children in peace. But when I looked at the baby, his tiny hand curling around the edge of the blanket, something inside me broke. The child had Anthony's eyes, innocent, unaware, completely blameless. "Come in," I said quietly. Marianne hesitated, then stepped inside. Water dripped from her coat onto the floor, each drop echoing in the silence. The baby stirred, then nestled against her chest. I motioned to the sofa. "Sit, you're drenched." "Thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling. Teresa peeked from behind the curtain, curiosity shining in her young eyes. I managed a calm smile. "It's all right, darling. Go get a towel." Once Marianne was settled, I poured tea, my hands shaking only slightly. The children sensed the tension and retreated quietly to their room. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, staring into the steaming cup. "After Anthony's arrest, I lost everything. The house was in his name. When the scandal spread, I couldn't find work. My parents refused to take me in. I've been moving from place to place with my son. I heard you opened a studio. I thought maybe you'd let me work, or at least let us rest for a night." Her voice cracked on the last word. I studied her, this woman who had once lived at the center of my husband's lies. She looked nothing like the enemy I had imagined. She looked like what I had been not so long ago. A woman holding her world together with trembling hands. "I can't promise much," I said finally, "but no child sleeps in the rain while I have a roof." Tears filled her eyes. "You're kinder than I deserve." "Kindness," I said softly, "isn't for those who deserve it. It's for those who need it." That night, Marianne and her baby slept in the small storage room behind the studio. I didn't know then that letting her in would change everything again, for both of us. In part 13, two women tied by betrayal would learn to share the same roof. And I'd discover that forgiveness can be the most dangerous form of courage. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the studio, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. The baby's soft cries broke the quiet, followed by Marianne's tired hum as she rocked him gently in her arms. For a few moments I simply watched from the doorway, unsure whether what I felt was pity, resentment, or something far more complicated. We had shared a man, a heartbreak, and a lie. Now we shared a roof. Life had a strange sense of irony. When I offered her breakfast, she insisted on helping. "Please," she said, "I've taken enough from you already." "Then you can wash the cups," I replied, my tone polite but distant. For the next few days, an uneasy rhythm settled between us. She worked quietly, often caring for her baby while I managed orders and clients. At night, we kept to our corners. She in the small storage room, me and the children in the back quarters. Conversation was sparse but not hostile. It was survival, pure and simple. One evening, as rain pattered softly on the tin roof, she approached me while I was mending a dress. "You should know," she began hesitantly. "Before he was arrested, Anthony wrote to me. He said he'd come back for us, for me and the baby." I kept stitching, though my fingers trembled slightly. "And did you believe him?" She sighed. "I wanted to, but by then, the newspapers had already printed everything. When I realized the truth, I thought of ending it all. If not for my son, I might have." Her words cut deep. I had hated her for years, imagined her as a thief of happiness. Yet hearing her pain felt like listening to my own reflection. We had both been fooled by the same man, both left to pick up the pieces of his choices. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, I sat with Marianne at the kitchen table. She was mending one of the baby's shirts by candlelight. "You sew well," I said softly. She smiled faintly. "My mother was a seamstress, too. She said stitches hold more than fabric. They hold stories together." Her words lingered long after the candle went out. In the weeks that followed, the studio began to flourish. With Marianne's help, we took on more clients: brides, tailors, schools. Her work was delicate and precise, her manners humble. Slowly, the gossip faded. Customers stopped seeing me as the banker's wife and started calling me Madame Geraldine, the dressmaker. Still, there were nights when I'd wake from dreams of the past. Anthony's voice, the sound of keys turning in a lock, the note that had changed everything. I'd find myself staring into the dark, wondering if forgiveness truly meant peace or just another form of surrender. One evening, as I was closing the shop, Marianne stood by the door, her baby asleep in her arms. "You've given us more than shelter," she said quietly. "You gave me a chance to live again." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something I never thought I'd say. "Maybe we both needed saving," I replied. "But peace built on buried pain never lasts." In part 14, a letter from the prison would arrive, written by the man neither of us wanted to remember, yet could never quite escape. The months rolled by quietly, like ripples after a storm. The studio grew busier, the children settled into school, and Marianne became not just an assistant, but a quiet presence that steadied the room. The baby, little Thomas, learned to crawl across bolts of fabric, laughing whenever the sunlight caught the colored threads. For a while, life almost felt normal. Then one afternoon in early spring, the mail arrived. It came in a neat brown envelope with an unfamiliar return stamp. I might have ignored it, but the handwriting stopped me cold. I would have known it anywhere. Anthony Miller. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen or heard from him since his sentencing, nearly a year earlier. My first instinct was to burn the letter, to erase it before his words could poison the fragile peace we'd built. But curiosity, or perhaps unfinished pain, won. I opened it. "My dear Geraldine, I do not expect your forgiveness, but I beg for your understanding. I think of you and the children every day in this miserable place. Time here strips a man bare. It forces him to see himself for what he truly is. I've done terrible things. But believe me when I say, not all of it was as it seemed. Edward was the one who pushed for the theft. I wanted out long before the arrest. When I realized the inspectors were closing in, I knew someone had warned them. I suspected you. And if that's true, then thank you. You might have saved me from becoming something worse than a thief. There is one thing I must ask of you. I have a son, I know that now. Please do not let him grow up thinking I was only a monster. Tell him I was weak, not wicked. That I loved him, even if I had no right to. Yours always, Anthony." I folded the letter slowly, every word pressing deeper into my chest. He was right about one thing. Time had stripped us both bare. But love, whatever remained of it, was something buried too deep to resurrect. That evening I told no one. I placed the letter in my sewing box beneath old spools of thread, next to Marianne's first note of gratitude. The past, it seemed, refused to stay buried. It wanted to share the same drawer as forgiveness. The next morning, I found Marianne at the work table, humming softly while stitching a hem. She noticed my pale face immediately. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," I said, forcing a small smile. "Just thinking about old times." I didn't tell her about the letter. Not yet. But as the day went on, I caught myself glancing at Thomas, his dark eyes, the shape of his jaw. Anthony's features lived on in him, a reminder that blood doesn't fade with distance. I thought the letter was the final ghost from my past, but I was wrong. In part 15, another visitor would come bearing a truth far heavier than words, one that could shatter the fragile life we had built all over again. You said. 3 weeks passed after the letter arrived. I told myself I had moved on, that Anthony's words were nothing but echoes of a man trying to rewrite his own sins. The letter remained locked in my sewing box, gathering dust beside faded spools of thread. Life, I thought, had finally quieted again. Then came the knock. It was a bright Saturday morning. Sunlight poured through the front windows of the studio. Marianne was fitting a client, the baby asleep in a basket near her feet. I was hemming a school uniform when the knock came, firm, deliberate, not the timid tap of a customer. I opened the door, and for a moment my breath caught. A tall man stood there, dressed in a gray coat, hat in hand. His face was lined, his expression serious but not unkind. "Mrs. Geraldine Miller?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded politely, then presented a small badge. "Inspector Raymond Mendez. We met once, during your husband's case. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Yet, I remember, I said, steadying my voice. May I come in for a moment? Marianne froze at the work table, her eyes darting toward me. I gave her a small nod. Of course, Inspector. He stepped inside, glancing around at the rows of fabric and half-finished dresses. You've built a fine business here, he said. A peaceful life, I hope. I try, I replied. He removed his hat and sighed, the kind of sigh that carried bad news. I wish I were here for pleasantries, Mrs. Miller, but I'm afraid it's about your husband. I felt my throat tighten. Is he alive? The inspector said quickly. But not well. He's been ill for several months, lung complications. He's requested a formal visit from you. It's his final request, I believe. The words hit harder than I expected. Anthony, dying alone in prison. After all the anger, the betrayal, and the years of silence, I hadn't imagined this ending. I understand this is difficult, the inspector continued. But he claims to have information, something he insists only you should hear. He wouldn't speak to the warden or to me, said it concerns unfinished business. I looked down at my trembling hands. Unfinished business. With Anthony, that could mean anything. Guilt, confession, or another hidden lie waiting to surface. I'll think about it, I said finally. The inspector nodded. He doesn't have much time. If you decide to go, send a letter to this address. He handed me a folded slip of paper and left quietly. When I turned back, Marianne was standing near the doorway, her face pale. Is he alive? I answered, my voice flat. Her eyes flickered. Relief, fear, confusion all at once. Will you go? I didn't answer. I simply looked out the window, the afternoon light spilling across the street, and felt that old ache stirring again. The one that came from unfinished wounds and unspoken truths. Some ghosts die slowly. In part 16, I would journey back to the one place I swore I'd never see again, to face the man who had once destroyed my world and was now asking for my forgiveness with his final breath. The letter from Inspector Mendez sat on my bedside table for 3 nights before I could bring myself to open it again. Each time I looked at it, my stomach twisted with dread, and something I couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness, not love, but a quiet need for closure. On the 4th morning, I made my decision. I told Marianne I'd be gone for the day. She didn't ask where. Perhaps she already knew. There are some journeys that speak for themselves in the silence before they begin. The train to St. Barrow Prison cut through fields dusted with early spring bloom. I sat by the window, my reflection flickering over the passing countryside. I remembered the woman I had been when I last traveled this road, frightened, uncertain, clinging to faith in a man who had already betrayed her. Today, I carried no illusions. At the prison gates, the guards checked my name against a list and led me through long corridors that smelled of metal, disinfectant, and forgotten time. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the narrow hallways. When the door to the infirmary opened, I almost didn't recognize him. Anthony was a ghost of the man I once knew. Thinner, hair streaked with gray, skin pale as parchment. The sharpness in his eyes was gone, replaced by something softer, heavier. Guilt, maybe? Geraldine? He whispered, his voice cracked and dry. You came. I stood at the foot of his bed, my hands clasped tightly. I wasn't sure I would. He gave a faint, humorless smile. You always had more courage than you knew. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the overhead light filled the silence. Then he gestured weakly toward the chair beside him. Please, sit. I don't have long. And I need you to know the truth. I hesitated, then sat. I never planned to kill you, he said suddenly. His words came out in a rush, as if years of confession had been waiting behind his ribs. That note, the one you found, and it wasn't meant for me. Edward wrote it to his own mistress. He feared exposure. But when you confronted him, he twisted everything, made me believe you'd betrayed me to the authorities. That's why I ran. That's why everything fell apart. I listened, expressionless. There were holes in his story, gaps shaped by convenience and regret. But I could see the truth in his eyes. He was a dying man reaching for peace. He reached out a trembling hand. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I can't leave this world knowing I never asked for it. I looked at him, the man who had been my husband, my destroyer, and in some strange way, my teacher. Slowly, I placed my hand over his. I forgave you, I said quietly, the moment I stopped needing your apology. Tears welled in his tired eyes. Then maybe that's enough. He closed his eyes, a faint smile flickering across his face. For the first time, he looked truly at peace. When I stepped out into the sunlight, I felt the air fill my lungs differently. Lighter, freer, final. Rehook. But even closure can have consequences. In part 17, I would return home to find the past still waiting. Not in a letter or a memory this time, but in the eyes of a child who was beginning to ask dangerous questions. The journey back from the prison felt shorter than the one that took me there. Perhaps it was because I carried no more anger. The grief had long settled into something quieter, acceptance, or maybe exhaustion. Anthony was gone. Before I even reached home, I knew. The guard's silence as I left the infirmary had said enough. When the train pulled into the capital, the air was thick with late afternoon haze. I walked the familiar streets toward the studio, my thoughts strangely calm. The past was finally where it belonged, behind me, or so I believed. Marianne met me at the door, her face pale with worry. "You've been gone all day. I was afraid something happened." I smiled faintly, setting my handbag on the counter. It did, but it's over now. She studied my face, searching for something in my eyes. "Did he?" "He's gone," I said simply. "He made peace with himself. That's all there was left to do." She nodded slowly. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The studio was quiet except for the ticking clock and the distant sounds of the city outside. That night, after closing, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the lights flicker across the street. The children were asleep, the baby too. For the first time in years, the silence didn't frighten me. It felt earned. But peace, I've learned, is never permanent. It's only borrowed. The next morning, I found Michael sitting at the kitchen table, holding something in his hands. My heart skipped when I saw it, the letter from Anthony. I had locked it away, but somehow he had found the key. "Where did you get that?" I asked gently. He looked up, his eyes dark and serious. "It fell out of your sewing box when I was looking for thread. I didn't mean to read it, but I did." I sat beside him, my pulse quickening. "What did you read, Michael?" "That he said he loved me. That he wasn't all bad." His voice trembled. "Was that true, Mama? Was he really a monster? Or just a man who made mistakes?" The question hit harder than any accusation could. He was too young to carry that kind of doubt, but old enough to sense the complexity adults hide behind silence. I reached for his hand. "He did terrible things," I said softly. "But once long ago, he also loved us, in his own broken way. You can hate what he did, but you don't have to hate him." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can forgive him." "You don't have to," I whispered. "Forgiveness isn't a gift for others. It's how we free ourselves." He nodded slowly, folding the letter and handing it back to me. "Can you keep it safe?" he asked. "I always have," I said, though part of me wondered whether safety and truth could ever live in the same drawer. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I reread the letter by candlelight. The words no longer hurt. They just existed, like scars after healing. But peace has one final test. In part 18, a revelation from Marianne would shake everything once more, forcing me to choose between protecting the truth or the people I now called my family. The morning after Michael found the letter, the studio felt unusually still. The usual rhythm of the sewing machines, the laughter of clients, even the faint humming of Marianne, all seemed muted, like the world itself was holding its breath. I noticed it first in her eyes. Marianne had always carried a quiet sadness, but that day it was different, heavier, final. After closing, she asked softly, "Can we talk?" We sat at the small wooden table, the same one where we'd shared countless cups of tea and unspoken thoughts. The baby little Thomas was asleep in his cradle nearby. His tiny breaths filled the silence. "I received a letter," she began, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. from the prison warden. Before Anthony died, he sent me something for you and for Thomas. My heart clenched. For me? She nodded and reached into her bag, pulling out a worn envelope. He left a statement, his final confession. I've read it, Geraldine, and I think you should too. I hesitated, then took the letter. The paper trembled in my hands. Anthony's handwriting was faint, but unmistakable. To Geraldine and Marianne, I owe you both truth before I go. The boy, Thomas, he's not only mine. He is our blood, Geraldine. You and I share him. When you were ill that winter, the doctor said you could no longer have children. I couldn't accept it. I thought love needed legacy, a name to continue. When Marianne came to work at the bank, she was young, desperate, easy to mold. I convinced her to help me build the family I thought I deserved. But it wasn't her fault. It was mine, my sin, my arrogance. She never knew the full truth until after. I used her, then destroyed both of you. Forgive her if you can. Forgive me if you must. Tell Thomas who he is only when he's old enough to understand, that he was born of guilt, but raised in love. Anthony, the room swayed. For a long time I couldn't speak. The world, which I thought had already delivered its cruelest blows, had found one more. Marianne's face was wet with tears. I didn't know, Geraldine, not then. He told me you couldn't bear children, that you'd left him long before I met him. I swear it, I believed her. In her eyes there was no deceit left, only shame and a fragile, painful honesty. I looked toward the sleeping child. His small chest rose and fell with steady rhythm, unaware of the burden his name carried. He's innocent, I whispered. Whatever his blood says, it changes nothing. He is yours and mine. We both lost everything to that man. Maybe we were meant to raise what's left of him together. Marianne broke down, and for the first time, I reached out and held her. Two women, once enemies, now bound by a child and the ghosts of one man's choices. But truth has a way of lingering, even when forgiven. In part 19, the final chapter, I would learn that love, in its truest form, isn't about what we inherit, but what we choose to keep alive. Years have a strange way of softening even the sharpest memories. They don't erase them. They just fold them gently like fragile cloth, tucking them away in the corners of our hearts where they can rest without cutting us open anymore. It's been 10 years since the day I read that final letter. The studio still stands on the same street, though the sign now reads Miller and Hart Designs, our shared name, mine and Marianne's. Clients know us as partners, not as two women who once shared a ghost. Life has been kind in small, steady ways. Michael is nearly grown now, apprenticing with a tailor in the city. Teresa is studying to become a teacher, patient, graceful, and far wiser than I was at her age. And Thomas, the boy whose birth was tangled in guilt, is 10 years old, full of laughter, mischief, and questions that could fill a library. He calls Marianne Mama and me Aunt Gertie, though love has long blurred the difference. Sometimes, when I watch him help sweep the studio or chase sunlight through the curtains, I see a glimpse of Anthony in the angle of his smile. But the resemblance doesn't hurt anymore. It feels like history acknowledging itself. Quietly, respectfully, before stepping aside. Marianne and I rarely speak of the past now. We've both earned the right to peace. Still, there are nights when we sit by the window after the children are asleep, sipping tea, our silence saying more than words could. There's comfort in shared survival, the kind that grows only between people who have both walked through the same fire and come out whole on the other side. I sometimes think of that girl I used to be, the young wife folding laundry in a quiet house, believing her life was small but safe. I want to tell her that the storm she feared would one day become her freedom, that she would lose everything she thought she needed and discover what truly mattered instead. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't an act of weakness. It's the final step of strength. The moment you stop letting your pain speak for you. I kept Anthony's letters all these years, not out of affection, but as reminders. They rest now in a small wooden box in the studio, beneath bolts of new fabric. One day, when Thomas is old enough, I'll tell him everything, not to burden him, but to free him from secrets. Because no truth should ever be inherited as a curse. As I write these final words, the evening sun slips through the window, painting gold over the old sewing table. The same table where betrayal was confessed, forgiveness was born, and two lives began again. The machine hums softly beside me. Outside, I can hear Marianne laughing with the children. Life continues. Imperfect, honest, and beautifully ours. Maybe this is what redemption truly looks like. Not the undoing of the past, but learning to stitch its torn pieces into something stronger. And as long as my hands can still sew, I'll keep mending what time tried to break. One thread, one truth, one heartbeat at a time.